Imagine waking up on a Thursday and finding your home listed as the venue for a 100-person community retreat. That's how I started my morning, coffee in hand, scrolling through the HOA newsletter and reading the phrase Lakeside Cabin under a QR code for rideshare coordination. For 3 years, I had poured sweat, time, and every saved dollar into that cabin. It wasn't a clubhouse or a rental. It was my grandfather's fishing shack reborn. How do you react when your private life is turned into a public event without your permission? The announcement felt like an itch that wouldn't go away. Curious at first, then dangerous. 100 strangers on a winding quarter-mile drive through the woods. Trucks parked where there shouldn't be. A canopy of liability hovering over every step. What if someone tripped on my dock? What if a catering tent collapsed during a storm? Insurance isn't a magic shield in stories like this. Policies have clauses, exclusions, and fine print that can devastate homeowners if events are commercial or unauthorized. The thought of my life's work becoming someone else's liability kept my stomach tight all morning. This wasn't theater. It was a slow-moving threat with real-dollar consequences. I pictured the worst-case scenarios not to be melodramatic, but to plan better. Vendor invoices attached to my address, a lawsuit claiming negligence, a claim denied because a group organized the event with no permits. What felt personal suddenly looked structural. Property law, HOA authority, insurance coverage, and I realized I couldn't rely on outrage alone. I had to prepare, document, and convert fury into strategy. So I did what I always do when the stakes are real. I slowed down, made a checklist, and started building a defensible position. This story isn't about yelling louder than someone else. It's about learning the quiet art of defending what's yours with clarity, paperwork, and community on your side. By the time I finished that morning, I had mapped every risk, updated insurance contacts, printed the deed and survey, and written an authorization form that left no ambiguity about responsibility. The choice wasn't revenge. It was a precise act of stewardship, protecting a legacy, a piece of land, and a life rebuilt with intention and calm. The road to my cabin is a narrow quarter-mile ribbon through trees. This private stretch funnels every visitor to a single farm-style steel pipe gate I installed after I rebuilt my grandfather's fishing shack. That gate is a boundary you can see and touch. It creates a moment of choice. When someone stops there, the question becomes tangible. Do you have permission to enter, or do you not? That clarity is sound in disputes because it moves the argument into action. I treated the gate as part of the record, not just a physical barrier. I installed a tamper-proof security wire with a visible serial number, threaded it through a reinforced hasp, and added a secondary lock that requires a specific key profile. I photographed the assembly from multiple angles, tested the latch under tension, and logged the serial number and the images with a dated note. These actions are ordinary until they are required as evidence. When proof matters, mundane preparation becomes decisive. Matching the hardware, I prepared the paperwork. I printed a certified copy of the recorded deed showing title, a detailed survey with precise boundary coordinates, and a concise insurance summary that identified exclusions for unauthorized commercial gatherings. I placed those documents in clear sleeves on a small folding table beside the gate. I set out an event host authorization and personal liability commitment on a clipboard. I had drafted that form after speaking with my insurance agent. The form required the signer to acknowledge responsibility for permits, vendor contracts, and any damages or injuries that might result from a significant event. The placement of the table was deliberate. Having the documents plainly visible accomplished 3 things. It provided arriving parties with immediate proof of ownership. It made the potential financial exposure explicit. And it converted a casual newsletter announcement into a formal recorded choice. This was not about public shaming. It was about removing ambiguity. Suppose an organization asserts the right to use private land. In that case, the relevant question becomes whether that assertion can be backed by signatures, dates, and a willingness to accept the legal consequences. I also created procedural redundancies. I called my insurance agent to inform them that I was on site and would be documenting any developments. I left a business card with the agent's contact information on the table. I took time-stamped photographs that showed the gate, the table, and the deed together. I informed 2 neighbors so there would be independent witnesses if needed. Those small redundancies, an email, a photograph, a neighbor's recollection, build a lattice of credibility that is far stronger than a shouted confrontation. The point of all this was simple. Quiet preparation is a form of courage. The gate did not have to be impenetrable. It had to make assumed entitlement costly and visible. By pairing clear documentation with modest physical controls, I shifted the burden to whoever claimed authority and let clarity do the heavy lifting. If you find yourself defending a home or legacy, adopt that posture. Document, communicate, and let the facts speak louder than emotion. It keeps you clear-headed and legally defensible. Neighbors began to arrive with quiet urgency, not to gossip but to corroborate. Mrs. Henderson, a retired paralegal with a habit of saving every county notice, walked up with a folder of dated letters she had written to the HOA. Mr. June, who keeps a home archive of community emails and printed newsletters, produced meeting minutes showing procedural irregularities. Their tone was steady. What they carried was plain, documents, dates, and the kind of small records that, when assembled, expose patterns rather than isolated mistakes. They told stories that made the single newsletter look like a symptom of something larger. Mrs. Henderson described an incident where Cynthia ordered landscapers to remove private flower, beds in the name of community beautification, leaving a homeowner with an $800 bill and no apology. Mr. June displayed a notice that announced a new restriction without any recorded vote. The Williamses recounted threats over driveway parking after Cynthia unilaterally imposed a ban, and the Johnsons handed over invoices from a contractor Cynthia had hired without board approval. Each anecdote by itself might have felt anecdotal. Together they formed a ledger of overreach. We formalized those accounts into written witness statements, each one dated and signed. I asked neighbors to stick to facts: what happened, when, who was involved, and what proof they could share. That discipline changed the tenor of our response. Emotion is powerful, but facts are persuasive. Courts, insurers, and impartial third parties listen to documents more readily than to loud complaints. Mrs. Henderson volunteered to help convert memories into usable statements, identifying where to attach receipts, emails, or photographs so the accounts would hold up under scrutiny. With 5 independent statements and scanned attachments in hand, I drafted a neighborhood petition. It was deliberately sober: a summary of events, citations to applicable bylaws, a list of vendor obligations incurred under the cabin address, and a clear statement of requested remedies: public retraction, vendor reimbursement, and a commitment to follow proper board procedures. We set a reasonable signature target and circulated the petition door-to-door and by email, inviting neighbors to sign if they supported transparent governance rather than ad hoc declarations from a single officer. The petition did more than tally signatures. It shifted power that Cynthia had relied on, informal authority, and the assumption that most residents would not organize, evaporated when confronted with organized, documented dissent. There is a satisfying justice in that moment. Entitlement meets accountability. We weren't seeking spectacle. We wanted boundaries restored and predictable governance. Uniting as a community turned individual irritation into collective capacity, and the petition became the lever that allowed us to insist on it. At the subsequent board meeting, we presented the petition with witnesses prepared to testify. Cynthia's narrative crumbled under cross-examination of dates and signatures. We then asked for remedies that would prevent future overreach: clear protocols, transparent notices, and mandatory board votes for property use announcements. The process restored confidence and taught neighbors how to enforce their rights civilly. Saturday morning, a white van rolled up the drive, and a locksmith stepped out with a toolbox and the kind of quiet confidence tradespeople carry. He was met by Grant Morgan, an HOA board member who had all the impatience and entitlement of someone used to decisions being rubber-stamped. Grant babbled, explaining that the HOA had the authority, arrangements were already in place, and we needed access. The locksmith listened without interrupting, opened his case, and set his tools down like a pause in a conversation. I walked over, held out a printed deed and the survey map, and explained that this gate was private property with a recorded access easement and that any damage would be the responsibility of whoever ordered it. I didn't shout. I didn't threaten. I presented facts and photographs, and I asked a simple question. Were you willing to cut a lock on private land without explicit authorization and with a claim of HOA authority alone? The locksmith took the documents and read them as if reading the room, professionally, deliberately. He told us what most people don't expect to hear. As a licensed contractor, his business insurance and licensing agreements required him to refuse work that could expose him to legal action. If he cut a lock and later it turned out the owner had not authorized entry, he could be sued, lose coverage, and jeopardize his livelihood. That statement landed like a visible line. It wasn't legal posturing. It was an operative fact about risk and professional survival. Grant's face flushed. He argued the chain of command, then leaned on the idea that the HOA had offered a community benefit. The locksmith closed the folder, shook his head, and said he couldn't proceed. For him, the question was not about sympathy or who was right. It was about whether his certificate and insurance would hold if someone later questioned what happened. Without his participation, the physical route to forcing access narrowed considerably. Grant stomped off toward his truck, muttering threats about a board meeting and taking this higher. But his bluster had lost its immediate power. Neutral expertise had converted an emotional escalation into a sober choice: press through with illegal or risky actions and accept the consequences, or step back and settle things in writing. Neighbors who watched breathed easier. The drama deflated into paperwork. That quiet refusal changed everything. When a neutral, competent actor declines to be part of your escalation, you lose more than workforce. You lose legitimacy. If you want to protect property, prepare and let professionals enforce the facts for you. Confrontation isn't about force. It's about making wrong actions costly and unlikely. Calm preparation wins more than courage. It wasn't just a newsletter or a few misdirected emails. By Friday afternoon, I discovered the HOA had already committed hundreds of dollars to vendors under my cabin's address. Portable toilets, catering trays, folding tables, and tent rentals totaling more than $2,500 had been ordered. Each invoice carried my property's location as the delivery point. At first, it felt surreal. A community event that didn't exist, on land I owned, with real-world financial consequences already in motion. How had this escalated so fast without my knowledge? How could anyone assume that a private cabin was open for public bookings? I called my insurance agent immediately. I needed clarity because what felt like a minor inconvenience was quickly turning into a potential financial nightmare. She explained calmly but firmly that unauthorized events, huge gatherings without permits, exposed the homeowner to significant liability. If someone tripped on a dock, slipped near the shoreline, or suffered any injury involving rented equipment, the homeowner could be personally liable. In extreme scenarios, settlements and legal fees could reach six figures, far exceeding the $2,500 in vendor commitments. I felt my stomach tighten. Suddenly, this wasn't about annoyance or ego. It was about protecting my financial stability and the home itself. Vendors began calling that afternoon. The portable toilet company, the tent supplier, and the catering service all asked for confirmation and payment. They were unaware that I had no authority to approve the event. Each call layered urgency over anxiety. If a payment wasn't made, vendors could pursue collection or even redirect service, potentially creating invoices tied to my name. The situation was spiraling, and I realized that any hesitation could translate into costly consequences. The risk wasn't abstract anymore. It was ringing my phone. I updated the liability form I had placed at the gate, expanding it to explicitly outline financial responsibility for vendor services, permits, insurance obligations, and personal liability for injuries. Every clause spelled out the costs and legal implications, including the fact that failure to comply could result in claims exceeding $100,000. This form transformed from a simple authorization sheet into a legal shield. Whoever insisted on proceeding with the event would have to sign acknowledging all risk and financial obligation. shifting responsibility squarely onto the HOA president. It wasn't confrontation for the sake of drama. It was the practical enforcement of boundaries. The moment I finished the updated form, I felt a measure of control return. The landscape of the conflict had shifted. What began as a newsletter error now involved concrete numbers, legal risk, and precise documentation. The narrative was no longer hypothetical. The stakes were visible and undeniable. Whoever attempted to move forward without acknowledging these responsibilities would face undeniable liability. In that clarity, I recognized a powerful truth. Preparation, documentation, and expert guidance turn fear into strategy. What could have become a six-figure disaster became a calculated negotiation, and the control rested entirely in facts, not emotion. The vendors, the HOA, and even my neighbors could see that the risk had been measured, recorded, and assigned, and that I was no longer negotiating in uncertainty. Tuesday morning arrived with an odd mixture of anticipation and tension. Families began to pull into the driveway, their SUVs and minivans winding down the quarter-mile path, QR codes in hand, expecting an event that had never been authorized. I stood by the gate with the folding table, deed, survey maps, and the updated liability form displayed clearly. As each vehicle stopped, parents looked around, confused, asking if the retreat had been rescheduled or if someone had made a mistake. That was the first moment the abstract stakes became tangible. 100 people arriving, vendors expecting delivery, and one unauthorized organizer about to be held accountable. I calmly approached each arriving family, explaining that the property was private. I informed them that any person claiming authority to host the event needed to sign a legal acknowledgement of responsibility for vendor contracts, permits, and any potential injuries. There was a pause in the air. Some faces registered relief at understanding why they had stopped. Others showed embarrassment that they had almost entered someone else's property unknowingly. Each interaction subtly reinforced the principle that accountability starts with clarity and documentation, and that boundaries are not negotiable. The confusion in their eyes was almost a reflection of the chaos that had preceded them. The situation demanded both composure and precision. Eventually, Cynthia Pierce arrived, her confident stride betraying her usual authority, but her expression shifted when she saw the folding table with documents spread neatly. I handed her the updated liability form, outlining personal responsibility for vendor payments exceeding $2,500 and potential six-figure legal exposure for injuries or property damage. I watched her eyes scan the numbers and clauses, the reality settling in that this was no longer a casual request. It was a legally binding acknowledgement of extreme financial and legal risk. That confidence she had wielded so often melted, replaced by disbelief and discomfort. The room, though outdoors and informal, felt heavy with tension. Witnesses, neighbors, and arriving families all absorbed the gravity of the moment. Cynthia hesitated, flipping through the pages as if scanning for a loophole, then slowly handed the form back, muttering, "I don't have the authority to accept this level of financial risk." There was a pause. The air seemed to shift, and the families, realizing the retreat was unauthorized and potentially dangerous, began to leave quietly, murmuring to one another. The HOA president, once so assured, stood exposed not with anger but with the weight of her own miscalculation. It was a rare display of accountability under public scrutiny, an unexpected twist in a confrontation that had been simmering for weeks. Observing the balance of authority tip so decisively, I felt a deep sense of relief, tempered by awareness of how quickly unchecked assumptions could escalate. The culmination was both instructive and satisfying. The families left unharmed, vendors would not be paid under my name, and the HOA's assumption of control had been publicly, documentably, and decisively challenged. In that moment, it was clear that calm preparation, strategic documentation, and measured enforcement of legal boundaries had transformed what could have been chaos into a structured resolution. Viewers can imagine themselves in the same position, turning tension into clarity, risk into leverage, and confrontation into a lesson in thoughtful, smart assertiveness. The stakes had been high, the embarrassment for the HOA tangible, and the principle reinforced. Authority unchecked meets accountability, and careful strategy allows the underdog to prevail. The aftermath of that day brought a mix of relief and resolution. Cynthia Pierce, confronted with documented vendor obligations and clear legal exposure, agreed to cover all outstanding invoices and formally acknowledge her overreach. It was a rare moment when authority bowed to accountability, and the consequences were both practical and symbolic. Justice had been served without escalation into aggression or prolonged conflict. The vendors were satisfied, my property remained protected, and the community witnessed a definitive lesson in responsibility and risk. I used the experience to strengthen the cabin's defenses further. Legal signage was installed to mark private boundaries clearly, and the access easement I had established was reinforced with additional documentation to prevent future ambiguity. These measures were not about creating barriers for neighbors or friends. They were about ensuring clarity, reducing risk, and preserving both property and peace of mind. Preparation became the silent protector of the cabin, turning proactive strategy into a safeguard against assumptions and unilateral decisions. Looking back, the story offers lessons far beyond a single HOA dispute. Boundaries, once clearly asserted, protect not only property but personal security and community trust. Preparation, from legal documents to witness statements, transforms potential chaos into controlled outcomes. Collaboration with neighbors fosters both social proof and collective strength, making individual vigilance part of a larger, resilient network. Each step, from documenting overreach to calmly enforcing legal responsibilities, demonstrated that smart, deliberate action outweighs reactive emotion. The moral is straightforward. Authority must be tested against facts, not fear. Boundaries must be defined before they are challenged. By combining preparation, documentation, and calm enforcement, it is possible to protect what is yours while educating those around you about limits and responsibility. In this case, the outcome was clear. The homeowner prevailed, the HOA was humbled, and the principles of accountability and foresight were affirmed. For anyone watching, the takeaway is empowering. Assert your rights, prepare meticulously, and rely on both legal clarity and community support to navigate challenges with confidence and integrity.